Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The day the world stood on the brink of war was supposed to be an ordinary day, at least for Princess Elara. She had prepared herself with every ounce of political training, diplomacy, and wisdom her father, the king, had passed down to her. Yet, as her hands tugged at the edge of her ceremonial dress, lined with silver and woven with the sigils of peace, a feeling of dread gnawed at her core. It wasn't the feeling of impending doom that caused her unease, it was the stark realization that the ancient peace between the humans and the dragons, an uneasy truce at best, was crumbling before her eyes. The wind that howled through the stone castle felt colder than usual. Even the tall banners hanging in the royal halls seemed stiff, as if they too sensed the weight of the days ahead. Elara's breath caught in her chest as her father's voice echoed from the throne room, summoning her for the final instructions before she embarked on what was to be the most dangerous mission of her life. "You must succeed, Elara. There's no other way." King Hrothgar's voice was deep, commanding, but she could hear the tremble beneath his words. "If this peace falls, war will not only ravage our lands. It will end us all." Elara looked up at her father. His once broad shoulders now sagged with the weight of the crown, his hair thinning with age, and yet there was still a fire in his eyes, a fire that would not accept defeat. She had inherited that fire, and it had carried her through every negotiation and every political obstacle in the past. But this was different. "I understand, father," Elara replied, her voice calm but laced with urgency. "I'll do everything in my power to prevent the war." The king nodded, but his expression was grim. The dragons have always been unpredictable. Their pride may cloud their reason. You'll be facing not just their king but generations of mistrust. Elara knew her father was right. The history between humans and dragons was stained with blood and betrayal. Although the peace treaty had held for centuries, it was fragile, and now, with rogue dragons attacking human settlements and rumors of conspiracies on both sides, the delicate balance was teetering. Her father's hand touched her shoulder. "Be careful, Elara. The fate of both our worlds rests on your shoulders." She nodded, unable to speak further. With one last glance at the familiar stone walls of her home, she turned and strode down the long corridor, where her escort awaited her. The journey to the Dragon Kingdom would be long and perilous, but there was no time to waste. War could break out at any moment, and if that happened, no one would be spared. The Dragon Prince, Kale, circled high above the rugged cliffs that marked the boundary of his kingdom. His wings, a glimmering shade of deep obsidian, cut through the air as he surveyed the lands below. There was a tension that rippled through the very air, an unease that even the dragons could not ignore. War was on the horizon. Kale's heart was heavy with the burden of leadership, a burden he hadn't sought but one that was thrust upon him by birthright. His father, the Dragon King, was old and set in his ways. To him, humans were nothing more than arrogant creatures who were better kept as enemies than allies. But Kale had seen too much of war. He had seen what it did to both humans and dragons alike. The devastation, the loss, it had never made sense to him. And now, with the peace treaty hanging by a thread, it seemed as though his people were ready to return to the old ways. A flicker of movement below caught his eye. A group of humans traveling through the mountain pass. Kale narrowed his eyes, his keen dragon senses identifying the insignia of the human royal family. They were here for diplomacy, no doubt. But Kale knew that not all dragons would welcome their presence. There were those within his own ranks who wanted war, and they would do anything to provoke it. As Kale banked low over the pass, his sharp vision detected a band of rogue dragons lurking in the shadows, preparing to ambush the human convoy. His heart pounded in his chest. If they succeeded, any chance of peace would be lost. With a swift dive, Kale shot toward the ambush, his massive form casting a dark shadow over the narrow pass. He could hear the hiss of the rogue dragons as they prepared to strike, their scales glistening in the sunlight. "Stand down!" Kale roared, his voice echoing off the cliffs. The rogue dragons snarled in response, their eyes filled with hatred. "You would defend them, Kale? The humans are weak. They will betray us, as they always have." Kale's talons dug into the rocky ground as he landed between the humans and the rogue dragons. His wings flared wide, creating an impenetrable barrier. "I will not allow this," he growled. "If you attack them, you will answer to me." For a moment, the air was thick with tension. The rogue dragons hissed, their eyes darting between Kale and the humans. But Kale stood firm, his gaze unyielding. After what felt like an eternity, the rogue dragons finally backed down, their wings twitching in frustration. With a final hiss, they retreated into the shadows, disappearing into the mountains. Kale turned to face the human convoy, his massive form towering over them. His eyes, however, were calm and steady. "Thank you," a voice called out from the group, and Kale's gaze fell on the woman who had spoken. She stepped forward, her bearing regal yet unafraid. Her eyes, a striking shade of green, met his with unwavering confidence. "I am Princess Allure," she said, her voice strong despite the situation. "And I believe we have much to discuss." As Kale led the humans deeper into dragon territory, a sense of urgency pressed upon him. Allure had spoken with wisdom and clarity during their brief exchange, and he could see the same fire in her eyes that he often felt in himself. They both knew what was at stake, the survival of their people, their kingdoms, and perhaps the world itself. As they neared the Dragon King's stronghold, Kale turned to Allure. "My father is not easily swayed," he warned her. "He is set in his ways, and he trusts few outside of our kind." Allure nodded, her expression resolute. "I didn't expect this to be easy. But I have to try." The Dragon King's throne room was a vast chamber carved from the heart of a mountain, its walls lined with ancient dragon relics and tapestries depicting battles long past. The king himself sat upon a massive stone throne, his golden scales shimmering in the dim light. His eyes, old and wise, surveyed Allure with suspicion. "You dare to enter my kingdom, human?" the Dragon King growled, his voice a low rumble that shook the very ground. Allure stepped forward, her chin held high. "I come in peace, your majesty. I seek a way to preserve the treaty between our people." The Dragon King's eyes narrowed. "Peace? There can be no peace between dragons and humans. Not after the betrayals we have endured." Kale stood at his father's side, his heart pounding. He had feared this response, but Allure remained undeterred. "War will destroy us both," Allure said, her voice firm. "I've seen the destruction it brings, and I know you have too. We can't let history repeat itself." The Dragon King's gaze shifted to his son. "And you, Kale? Do you agree with this human? Do you think peace is still possible?" Kale hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "I believe that war will only bring ruin to both our people, father. We must find another way." The king's eyes flashed with anger, but beneath it, there was a glimmer of something else, uncertainty. He turned his gaze back to Allure. "And what do you propose, human? What would you offer in exchange for peace?" Allure took a deep breath. "A new treaty. One built on trust, not fear. We can work together," share our knowledge, and ensure that both our people prosper. But it will require sacrifice. The Dragon King's eyes narrowed. Sacrifice? What sacrifice do you speak of? Kale stepped forward, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. I will offer myself as a binding force between our two races, he said, his voice steady. There is an ancient ritual, a rite of binding, that will tie my life force to that of Princess Alara's. If one of us is harmed, the other will suffer the same fate. It will be a symbol of trust and unity between our people. The Dragon King's eyes widened in shock, and Alara's breath caught in her throat. It was a ritual she had only heard of in myths, one that required immense courage and sacrifice. If they went through with it, their fates would be forever intertwined. You would do this? The Dragon King asked, his voice filled with disbelief. You would tie your life to a human? Kale nodded, his expression resolute. For peace, yes. I would. Alara stepped forward, her voice soft but unwavering. And I would do the same. For the sake of our people. The binding ritual was a solemn affair, held in the ancient Temple of Unity, deep within the Dragon Lands. Alara and Kale stood at the center of the chamber, surrounded by the elders of both their races. The air was thick with magic, and a sense of gravity hung over the gathering. As the ritual began, a glowing circle of light enveloped them, and they could feel the power of the ancient magic coursing through their veins. Their lives, once separate, were now bound together by an unbreakable thread. The connection was instant, a surge of energy that left both of them breathless. When the ritual was complete, Kale and Alara stood side by side, their fates forever entwined. The bond between them was not just physical, it was something deeper, a connection that transcended their differences and united them in a common purpose. The Dragon King, witnessing the sacrifice his son had made, finally relented. Very well, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. There will be no war. We will honor this new treaty. The days that followed were filled with cautious hope. The rogue dragons were brought to justice, and the human nobles who had sought to provoke war were exposed. Both the human and dragon kingdoms began the slow process of rebuilding, forging a new alliance based on trust and cooperation. Alara and Kale, now forever bound by the ritual, became symbols of the peace that had been hard-won. They traveled between their kingdoms, working tirelessly to ensure that the fragile peace held strong, but as they stood together on the balcony of the Dragon King's palace, looking out over the horizon, they knew that the future would not be without its challenges. The road to lasting peace was long, and there would always be those who sought to undermine it. Do you think we did the right thing? Alara asked, her voice soft as the wind tousled her hair. Kale turned to her, his gaze steady. I believe that we gave our people a chance. And that's all we can do. Alara nodded, her heart filled with both hope and uncertainty. The bond between them was more than just a symbol of peace, it was a reminder of the sacrifices they had made, and the responsibility they now carried. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that as long as they stood united, there was hope for a brighter future. Alara stood on the balcony, the cool evening breeze brushing against her skin as she gazed out over the vast expanse of dragon lands below. The sun was dipping behind the mountains, casting a soft, golden glow across the horizon. It was a sight she had come to appreciate in the days since the binding ritual. The world felt different now, not just because of the peace that had been achieved, but because of the bond she shared with Kale. The connection between them was subtle, but it was always there, a quiet presence at the back of her mind. She could feel his emotions, his thoughts, like a faint whisper in her consciousness. It was strange at first, this constant awareness of someone else, but over time, she had grown accustomed to it. It gave her a sense of comfort, knowing that no matter where they were, they would always be connected. Kale stepped out onto the balcony beside her, his wings folded neatly against his back. He stood in silence for a moment, watching the sunset with her, before finally speaking. "Things feel quieter now," he said, his voice low. Elara nodded. "It's strange, isn't it? After everything that's happened, it feels like the world should have changed more. But it's still the same. The sun still sets, the wind still blows, and yet, everything is different." Kale glanced at her, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I suppose that's the way of things. Change doesn't always come in the way we expect." She returned his smile, a warmth spreading through her chest. "No, it doesn't." They stood there for a while longer, the silence between them comfortable, until Kale's expression grew more serious. "The council meeting is tomorrow. The elders are still wary about the new treaty." Elara sighed, the weight of their ongoing responsibilities settling on her shoulders once again. "I know. My father's advisors are no different. They're concerned about the future, about whether this peace will hold." Kale's gaze hardened. "There'll always be those who doubt. There's still mistrust on both sides, old wounds that won't heal overnight." Elara turned to face him fully, her hand reaching out to rest on his arm. "We knew this wouldn't be easy. But we've already come this far. We'll continue to prove them wrong, one step at a time." Kale's eyes softened at her touch, and he nodded. "You're right. We'll find a way." They lingered there for a moment longer, and then, as if drawn by the same unspoken thought, they both turned and walked back inside the palace. The following day, the council chamber was filled with tension. Elara sat beside Kale, her posture straight and composed as the dragon elders gathered around the massive stone table. Their faces were stern, their eyes filled with doubt. Across from them sat the human delegation, her father's most trusted advisors, men who had seen the horrors of war and feared its return. The Dragon King presided over the meeting, his golden eyes sweeping over the room with a sense of authority that silenced even the boldest voices. He was no longer as openly hostile as he had once been, but the weight of centuries of mistrust was still evident in his gaze. "We are here to discuss the future of our alliance," the Dragon King began, his voice low and commanding. "The treaty has been signed, but that does not guarantee its success. There are those within both kingdoms who believe this peace will not last." One of the human advisors, Lord Heron, spoke up. "With respect, Your Majesty, we have already seen resistance from within your ranks. Rogue dragons attacked Princess Elara's convoy before she even reached your kingdom. How can we trust that all dragons will honor the treaty?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the human delegation, and Elara felt a pang of frustration. She knew that not all dragons were in favor of the peace, just as not all humans were, but focusing on past betrayals would only fuel more conflict. Kale spoke up before she could. "The rogue factions have been dealt with. Those responsible for the attacks have been brought to justice. But we must acknowledge that mistrust exists on both sides. It is not only dragons who are wary of this alliance." The dragon elder sitting across from Kale, a grizzled, battle-worn dragon named Halder, let out a deep growl. "You speak as if we are equals, Prince Kale. But we are not. Dragons have always been the superior race. It is only out of mercy that we allowed humans to exist at all." Kale's expression darkened, but he remained calm. "That kind of thinking is what led us to the brink of war in the first place. If we continue to believe that one race is superior to the other, we will never achieve true peace." Halder's eyes flashed with anger, but he said nothing further, his jaw clenching tightly. Elara took the opportunity to speak, her voice steady but firm. We cannot ignore the history between our people, but we also cannot let it define our future. The world is changing, and if we do not change with it, we will destroy ourselves. The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. Even the Dragon King seemed to consider them carefully. After a long pause, he spoke. Princess Elara is right. The past cannot be undone, but it can be learned from. This peace may be fragile now, but it can be strengthened. It will require time, effort, and sacrifice. Another human advisor, Lord Garrick, nodded. We must focus on building trust. Perhaps we can establish joint projects between our kingdoms, trade routes, shared knowledge, diplomatic exchanges. Something to show our people that we can work together. The suggestion was met with cautious approval from both sides. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. Over the next few weeks, the groundwork for the new alliance began to take shape. Diplomatic envoys were sent between the two kingdoms, and trade agreements were negotiated. Slowly but surely, a new sense of cooperation began to emerge, but it wasn't without its challenges. There were still factions on both sides that sought to undermine the peace. Elara and Kale worked tirelessly to quell any unrest, using their bond as a symbol of unity between their people. Their connection, forged through the binding ritual, had become a powerful symbol, a reminder that peace was possible, even between two vastly different races. One evening, as they walked through the halls of the Dragon Palace, Elara felt a tug of unease through the bond. She glanced at Kale, who had also stopped, his expression tense. "Do you feel that?" she asked softly. Kale nodded, his brow furrowing. "Something's not right." They hurried toward the source of the disturbance, their footsteps echoing in the vast corridors. When they arrived at the council chamber, they found a group of rogue dragons confronting the Dragon King. Their leader, a fierce dragon named Zephron, stood at the forefront, his eyes blazing with fury. "This peace is a lie," Zephron roared. "We are dragons, the rulers of this world. We should not bow to humans or anyone else." The Dragon King's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Kale stepped forward. "Enough, Zephron. This peace is not about submission. It's about survival." Zephron snarled, his wings flaring in anger. "You would betray your own kind for the sake of these weaklings?" Kale's voice was calm but firm. "I would do what is necessary to ensure the survival of both our races. War will not bring us victory. It will bring us destruction." Zephron's gaze shifted to Elara, and a cruel smile spread across his face. "Ah, the human princess. The one who has bewitched our prince. Perhaps if we rid ourselves of her, we can finally be free of this madness." Before anyone could react, Zephron lunged at Elara, his claws outstretched. But Kale was faster. In an instant, he was between them, his wings flaring as he blocked the attack. The force of the blow sent Kale and Zephron crashing into the wall, and Elara's heart raced as she watched the two dragons grapple. The bond between her and Kale pulsed with a sharp pain, and she knew that if he fell, so would she. With a fierce roar, Kale overpowered Zephron, pinning him to the ground. His voice was low and dangerous. "You will not harm her. You will not harm anyone." Zephron struggled for a moment before finally going limp, his eyes filled with hatred. "This peace will never last," he hissed. Kale released him, stepping back as the guards moved in to restrain the rogue dragon. As they dragged Zephron away, Kale turned to Elara, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Elara nodded, though her heart was still pounding. "I'm fine, thanks to you." Kale let out a breath of relief, and for a moment, they simply stood there, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. In the days that followed, the rogue faction was dealt with, and the peace that Elara and Kale had fought so hard for began to solidify. It wasn't perfect. There were still those who doubted, those who feared what the future might hold, but it was a start. Elara and Kale knew that their journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome. But as long as they stood together, they believed they could face whatever came their way. The bond they shared had become more than just a symbol of peace. It had become the foundation of a new future, one built on trust, understanding, and the belief that two very different races could find common ground. As they stood on the balcony once more, watching the sun set over the horizon, Elara felt a sense of hope that had once seemed impossible. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt bright, and so, with Kale by her side, she faced that future with courage, knowing that they had already achieved the impossible, and that there was so much more still to come.